Wow, how do I follow Dr. Edelman? It's brutal. But it's so great to be in a room with so many type 1 people. It's amazing. I'm going to talk about progress on type 1, what we're doing at JDRF. Steve pointed out I'm the chief mission officer at JDRF, and people always say, what is that? That sounds very Star Trek. What's the mission? And the mission, and I know many of you have cure stories, you know, you've heard about a cure for a long time, but that's the mission, is to try to cure this disease. And I'll be very honest where we are. You're not going to hear it's going to be 5 years from me, but that's our goal. But the real mission is people with diabetes doing better. You know, we're going to try to cure the disease. In the meantime, we're going to try to help people do better with this disease. That's better glucose control, it's easier quality of life. And to do that, we fund research, but we also need to think about the other stuff that goes into that. Research is part of it, and you're going to hear from a lot of amazing researchers, but it's also regulatory approval. It's also affordability. That's a huge issue right now. It's also, will a doctor prescribe something? If any of this stuff is broken, we don't achieve the mission. So I work on our research team, but I also work on our policy team, because all of this has to synchronize to achieve our mission. So I'm big on Twitter, and this joke has been played a few times, but I don't know if you guys follow that Twitter, but you know, I work in policy, and in Washington things are crazy, and the president picked up on the conference. This retreat is huge. Congratulations, Steve. Guys, it's amazing. So once again, the president's being polarizing. I didn't say it. Jeremy, apparently you did. I don't think people without type 1 are losers. Lots of non-type 1 friends. So sorry. I love that tweet generator. I've gotten so much action out of that. So my type 1 connection, Steve pointed out, is here's me. We all have the picture when we were diagnosed. I was diagnosed in 1984. I'm the oldest of 6 kids. This is my brother Steve, and when he was diagnosed at 3. So he's also a legend. I love the legend. Thank you, TCOID. I was always a legend in my own mind, but now it's been validated. But you know, just like Steve said, I asked actually about a year ago for folks to send me pictures of why they're involved at JDRF or their type 1 connection. And to me, this is what it's all about. It's the kids, it's adults. Brendan's here. Oh gosh, this slide's not coming up completely. It's just usually a full collage. But it's all about you. It's about people with type 1 diabetes and how do we all work together, living our lives. You know, I try to tell an inspirational story, but I'm very aware of how hard this disease is to live with every single day. It never goes away. So that's why I do this job and what it's all about, just like Steve talked about. So progression, because when I talk about research, we haven't found a cure, and that is a sore spot. We have some amazing people. Dr. Mark Atkinson will talk about the drive towards a cure. But we do need to think about how far we've come. So I did put a few slides. If you don't know the history of diabetes, where the term comes from, Steve, you talked about urine testing. I was just with a person who talked to me about this diagnosis. So back in ancient Egyptian and Greek times, this word was coined because they noticed people who were essentially wasting away. And ants were attracted to the urine. So this diabetes mellitus, CIV diabetes, which is this, it seemed like the food was just passing through these people, and when they peed, the urine was sweet. And I told this story recently, and I imagine there may be somebody in the room, that somebody said, yeah, I used to taste my urine to see if I was high. Anybody in the room taste their urine? I was going to see it anyway. I'm not going to point it out. But it shows you, I mean, that would be pretty rough. I don't know. Of course, diabetes describes many different forms and characterized by high blood sugar. We all know that. And you think about progression, all of us in this room, the type 1s in the room, in the history of mankind, there is a tiny window that we're alive. You think of Banting, Best, McLeod. I know we have a few Canadians here. I always love going to Toronto, and I've met one of the founding JDRF family in Toronto, I had dinner with the parents, and they said, oh gosh, remember when we used to have Charlie Best over the house? And I thought that was such an amazing link to this story of these children in the early 20s who were being starved just to get a few extra months out of their lives because the families knew they were going to die, to living. And insulin, the discovery of insulin, here's one of these famous pictures of before and after insulin. So there, in the history of man, we were dead before the 1920s, and that's a good story, obviously, a Nobel Prize. Steve pointed out, and my family started about 40 years ago, test tape. You think about that, and Steve, you hit the nail on the head, how hard it was. When we were kids, my brother was diagnosed, I didn't have diabetes yet. We had a young lady across the street from us at about 25 was completely blinded from type 1. So you can imagine being kids and seeing this young person. We're doing 1 or 2 shots a day, urine testing. I love these pictures of the old stuff, and we have the old stuff. This is I know many of you use this, and we called it the guillotine. Yeah, somebody said they have PTSD, absolutely. I mean, one of my brothers is an industrial designer, and I always say this goes in the annals of bad industrial design. We remember this. So I was diagnosed on these strips, and I know there's a debate on CGM accuracy. It still goes on. But look at the numbers here. 80, 120, 180, 240, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. When I was diagnosed, just like Steve, I said to my parents, I have diabetes. And most parents who have a kid, you think you're gonna know that the next one, turns out that most don't pick it up. My parents didn't. They thought, oh, he's in puberty, he's growing. And I was black on here. Of course, as kids, we had a little thing that we would fill out our numbers on the fridge. And our vision always seemed to be lighter than our parents' vision. 120, 180, it looks lighter. I'll talk a little bit about devices. We have a great panel talking about devices today. If you go to the Medtronic headquarters just up the highway in Northridge, California, you can see one of these old artificial pancreas prototypes. Not the most portable insulin pump. If you don't know those, how many blue brick people in the room? We must have a few blue bricks. Steve did. The blue brick is an amazing story. Dean Kamen was a young student. His brother was a pediatric oncologist at Yale and wanted to dose chemotherapy throughout a 24-hour period instead of in big doses so kids would get less sick. And 2 doctors who are still very involved in the field, Doctors Bill Tamberlane and Bob Sherwin, saw the applicability, worked, and this was commercialized. And you think, Bill will show pictures of kids playing basketball with this pump. I mean, you can go and look at the Omnipod and Tandem and all the Medtronic cool pumps that are here. I mean, look how far we've come. And then the first artificial pancreas, and I see Jeffrey Brewer and Ed Damiano, and a number of people will be talking about artificial pancreas. We had an artificial pancreas that worked in the 70s called the Biostatter. And it gets into a theme of mine, which is you have diabetes and you have life. And where's the balance point? So here, the diabetes was normalized. But if you look at the woman, not the best quality of life. So, at JDRF, this is a theme of ours, is we've got to do better than just glycemic control. It's got to fit in your life. Now, very quickly, and Dr. Anhalt will talk about this, we know we need to do better, and I'm going to race through this because we have lots of great speakers. But just highlight, we've come a long way, but diabetes, everybody in this room knows, it is really, really hard, even with the best tools. Only 1 in 5 kids in the T1D exchange make A1C goal, 7.5, and about 1 in 3 adults. This is 25 years after the DCCT, essentially. And this is a study, very quickly, that I'll show you that JDRF funded, that just showed, one of the things you'll hear from some doctors is, if you just tried harder, this idea of compliance, we need to be more compliant with your therapy. It's a myth. It is an absolute myth. So, and Steve pointed out the 5.8 A1C person. Most of those people have beta cell function, actually. No offense. It's really, really hard. And this study nailed this for me. I'm going to walk you through it because it just, to me, really highlights how hard this is. This was a study at Stanford and the Barbara Davis Center, and Dr. Buckingham is here. He was one of the investigators of this study, where they had a prototype system that tried to reduce lows overnight. So people were an insulin pump, a CGM, were testing 8 times a day, were in a clinical trial, and people in clinical trials tend to do better. And they had a system that on some nights it worked, meaning the computer controlled the pump, other nights it didn't. The punchline is the system worked, which is great. But the interesting thing of me to this study was the control nights where the system wasn't doing the diabetes for them. In kids, 8% of the nights, so almost 1 in every 10 nights, they had over 2 hours below 60. In little kids, it was 5% of the night, so essentially once in every 3 weeks. In adults, 11% of the nights, people were spending 2 hours or more below 60. So this is every tool in the book, and it's still hard. So we need to do better. So JDRF, we fund research, and we are very involved in policy now. And again, this is my little simple balancing act. We're trying to figure out tools that do the best on both sides of the equation. It's got to help your diabetes, but it's got to be easy. Because a lot of things, like I could test my finger 25 times a day and get better diabetes health, but that's not a great quality of life. So what's the balancing point? So we work at all ages and all stages. Some people think JDRF is just focused on kids. We're not. It's anybody with type 1 diabetes from the beginning, if you're at risk, to complications. And I'll talk very quickly about some of the areas. Artificial pancreas, you're going to hear a panel talk about this. We've made amazing progress. A number of companies are working and developing and delivering systems. Medtronic has launched a hybrid closed loop. We can get into the debate, is this an artificial pancreas? And I can debate you offline on what that means. But the bottom line is automated insulin delivery is here. I've been using one of the reverse engineered systems for the last 6 or 7 months, and I haven't woken up above 120 in 7 months. That's computer power. So we need commercial versions, and you'll hear from Dr. Damiano, Jeffrey Brewer from Bigfoot, and others. All of these companies are working. So this is amazing progress that's going to help you. Not a cure, but it'll help you. Some other work, Dr. Pettis has been part of our ViaSight trial. Could we cure type 1 diabetes, and I use air quotes, without fixing autoimmunity? ViaSight's been a leading company on beta cell encapsulation. JDRF is funding over 25 groups working in this space. They package the cells to protect them from the immune system. And this has been kind of a holy grail for a long time. But it's in human clinical trials, and Dr. Pettis is one of the physicians working in this space. Amazing progress. The cells now make insulin. We can take stem cells and get them to make insulin. The question is, how do you package them and protect them? There are many, many companies working, and I think that's really exciting. Smart insulin. So we didn't talk a lot about the different forms of insulin, but many of us use cow and pig insulin, the legends in the room. But we've seen insulin advances that have been tremendous. Kind of the holy grail here is, could you have an insulin that only works when your body needs it? It's smart, so to speak. And we funded a company that was acquired by Merck that did this. And this is a technical slide, but I'll walk you through it because it's a simple concept. The idea is, could you have the insulin only work when the blood sugars go high? And the way that the company that Merck acquired came out of MIT, and what the guys did was they put a sugar on the insulin molecule. So this little stop sign-like thing is representative of a sugar. That's what an oligosaccharide is supposed to, that's a fancy term for an oligosaccharide. So essentially what happens in this insulin is when you inject it, it actually gets stuck on the surface of your cells. And when it's stuck on the surface of your cells, it can't do the normal insulin job, which is to tell the cells to take up glucose. But if glucose levels go up, and that's the little circles here, you see that the circles fit better where it's sticking than the stop sign. So we call this in biochemistry competitive binding, that the glucose binds better. And if their glucose levels go up, it gets knocked out into your bloodstream, to go do its normal job. And in animal studies, this company could inject this insulin and normalize. These were rats. I mean, you can take this for, they're very diabetic rats. If they don't take insulin, they die. It sounds, but they are diabetic. And they could normalize the blood sugar for 5 days at a time with one injection. And this is eating a lot of food, it's eating a little food, it's running on a wheel, it's laying around the cage. It's research. But this has moved into human clinical trials, and we just met with the Merck team. One of their candidates isn't moving forward, but they're working hard to have a candidate that will. It's going to take time. Again, I can't give you time frames here. I'm not going to promise time frames. But I can tell you that they're in human clinical trials. That shows you the seriousness of the company here. And we're funding a number of different companies and approaches of smart insulin. Our GRI stands for glucose responsive insulin. Prevention. So I know a number of you in this room have multiple people affected with diabetes. I'm one of those families. Prevention is my biggest concern. If you talk to a lot of adults, they actually start to deprioritizing themselves and, of course, think of their kids first. That's the nature of parenthood. What we know, unfortunately, is type 1 diabetes is heritable. It's not what we would call Mendelian genetics, like if you go back to your pea plants, and because it's not a single gene. There are a lot of genes involved in diabetes, and it's complicated. We call it polygenic. But we know if you have a twin, you have a high risk that the other twin's going to get it. So there's a genetic component, and then there's an environmental component. But it's a strong genetic component if you have the identical genes. If you have multiple affected type 1 people in your family, the risk goes way up for other family members. And this isn't just kids. This is of parents as well. I'm going to digress. In Europe right now, 50% of type 1 diagnoses are above age 30. It's amazing. And it's going way up in the US. Siblings, 8%, but if you have the right genes, it can go way up. Now this is the scary part for me. As a father, as a male with type 1, my kids have a 5% risk of getting type 1. In the general population, the risk for a person, if we went out there, it's about 0.4%. So this is very elevated. And if you're a female, it's a little bit lower. Again, we don't understand this. And here's the 0.4%. So this shows us that we need to focus on prevention. And a lot of adults, I'm so glad to see so many adults learning and coming, don't get involved because they say, it's just about me and I don't want diabetes to define my life. It's actually more than you. It's your family. And we need to do all we can to stop this disease from happening in the future. So we actually have worked a lot, and this work, Mark Atkinson's here, he's an amazing T1D champion researcher, has been on the front line of a lot of this work. But we essentially know now you can predict people, not only genetically, but by blood sampling. And we know now if you're going to get type 1 well before you have symptoms. In fact, we now have stages of type 1 that if you have 2 autoantibodies, we say that you have stage 1 type 1 diabetes now. Normal blood sugar levels. And you would say, well, why is this important? It's important because for companies to do trials, we have a number of companies who want to do vaccines and stop type 1 from happening. If you were going to vaccinate the average child in this country, you would have a high safety bar because the risk is 0.4%. But now, if you have a child who has 2 antibodies and normal blood sugar levels, your desire to get a clinical trial to stop that from happening, the progression goes way up, and the risk-benefit changes. So we have a number of companies, because of this, going full tilt to try to stop type 1 diabetes. In fact, Janssen, which is the pharma arm of J&J for diabetes, has a program called the T1D Interceptor Program, which is amazing. And it's because of this work. This is years and years of research. Our CEO, Derek Rapp, has a son with type 1. He has one who have 4 autoantibodies and normal blood sugar. If you have 4 autoantibodies, the risk curves say you have a 100% chance of getting the disease. So he was part of the oral insulin trial that just reported out last week. So we don't need to get into that. I want to make sure we finish. Ultimately, can you cure this disease? Could people with type 1 walk away one day? It's a big question. We have a lot of legends in the room, been doing this a long time. Dr. Atkinson will talk about his work. Some of his work has been seminal in showing us that even people who've had diabetes for a long, long time, their pancreases are probably trying to get back functionality. But we have this immune response that's beating us back. And restoration will take 2 things. It'll take stopping, I left out a slide, but I'll just talk about it. Stopping the autoimmune response, and you'll hear about the autoimmunity, and if you want to grab me, I'm very excited about what's going on, because autoimmunity, the research in type 1 is now blending with other autoimmune diseases and cancer biology. So we're seeing a huge push on autoimmune understanding. Then the beta cells going again. And there are a number of companies working, because beta cell restoration really is applicable to type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So restoration, our goal of curing this disease, it's still going to take time. I'm not going to tell you it's 5 years. It's not 5 years. It's not 10 years, unfortunately. I'm sorry. I'm going to be honest. We don't know how to cure this disease yet, but we're pushing as hard as humanly possible. And that's our ultimate goal. So JDRF, we're about curing the disease, but making sure people live easier and better lives. And this, I'm losing stuff on the Mac here, Steve. But it takes all of these steps in place. So what's missing here is you need companies involved, you need basic research, you need regulatory approval, that's what's missing in this slide. Healthcare coverage and affordability, doctors, because it's all about better outcomes. We're not successful unless you are doing better. Simple as that. You know, we fought a really, really hard battle for Medicare coverage of CGM. Yeah. JDRF spent millions of dollars there, actually, over almost 9 years. I was in Baltimore and Washington. I have been using a CGM for 11 years. The fact that the people who are most vulnerable to severe hypoglycemia didn't have access means we didn't achieve the mission yet. And that's what this is all about. So the last little bit, exercise. Some of us were out exercising. Oh, see, my pictures aren't showing up. You showed my picture with my hairdo. But ultimately, I tweet out a lot.
My computer scans for porn.
I was running in a Speedo. But I always tweet out that I understand how hard diabetes is. My brother has severe hypoglycemia problems. I've been doing this. We've been both for 40 years now. But I've run 20 marathons with type 1 diabetes. We were out this morning, ran to the beach. And I think, you know, ultimately, the best advice my parents, Steve talked about his mom, my parents said to my brother and me growing up, you're going to do anything your friends want to do and more. And it may be harder, you may have to work harder, you may have setbacks, but I think I feel fortunate to be here, and I feel fortunate to be friends with Steve and Jeremy, and I'm so grateful for all TCOID does, and the partnership JDRF has with TCOID. You guys are amazing, and I really appreciate all you listening. Thanks.